A robust trade policy is incredibly important to me and my constituents. As I think about my district, it's heavy agriculture and manufacturing whose jobs and economic success rely on opportunities to send our great American products all over the world. However, when countries don't play by the same rules and standards as everyone else, this causes problems. Non-market countries like China, who engage in malign and predatory trade and economic practices, must be held accountable. China plays the long game through coercive trade and economic agreements, pressuring countries around the world to cede to their terms for investment. I also serve on the Intelligence Committee and the new Select Committee on China, and I learn every day about the growing threats from China. And I believe the Biden administration is missing key opportunities to push back against and hold China accountable for their trade practices. The United States should be investing in substantive trade policy with partners and allies in the Indo-Pacific region to strengthen global trade policy and make it harder for China to manipulate the system. Mr. Duesenberg, I think we can all agree that China has outsized economic ambitions, but they manipulate the global economic system and multilateral institutions to get their way. It's been over 20 years since we allowed China into the WTO. In retrospect, was that a mistake? Why or why not?
Well, I was one of the few on my side of the aisle to argue against letting them in the first place. So I think it was a mistake. So what do we do now? I can agree with Mr. Jameson about possibly considering going to an annual renewal of MFN status. But I think it also is incumbent on us to think about alternative structures that exclude China. China is a mercantilist nation. We have lots of friends. I wish we had more friends, more staunch friends, for instance, in Europe, who agree with us on things, but I do think that we should try to erect other trade agreements, and I've argued for regional agreements. We could expand NAFTA. I do still think that we should join the CPTPP. Mr. Jameson mentioned sectoral agreements. We need to have alternative structures that exclude China, because China is not a faithful enforcer of its own agreements.
Thank you. Mr. Goodman, I and many of my colleagues have expressed our concerns about IPEF, and you mentioned that, as an insufficient tool to counter China's influence in the Indo-Pacific region, particularly because it has no enforcement mechanisms, in my view, non-market access. How would you assess from a regional perspective, IPEF as a counter or an alternative to CPTPP?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. And I agree with you. I think one of the problems with IPEF is that it is not a formal trade agreement that's going to have an enforcement mechanism. And I've seen many of these executive agreements over the years that can do useful things, but they tend to get put in a drawer and then not followed up on. And so there's no substitute for having an agreement that is approved by Congress and then has built-in enforcement mechanisms. So I think that is one of the reasons that we ought to be looking at things like CPTPP or some other arrangement that is more like a traditional formal trade agreement. Can I just, in the answer on the other question, I should have added IP and subsidies, huge issues in China, and we ought to be taking those on, including working with allies, as Ambassador Lighthizer was doing with this trilateral with Japan and Europe. That kind of effort is really important in getting China to address some of these practices that we're all troubled by.
Thank you. Mr. Greer, the question that I asked Mr. Duesenberg about whether it was a mistake 20 years ago to allow China into the WTO, do you have an answer on that, yes or no, and any other comments?
The answer is yes. And I think we have data now, right? We have data. We can, at the time, like Mr. Duesenberg said, a lot of people said it was not a great idea, but went forward anyway. But now we have 23 years of data, and we can see the jobs that were lost. We can see the factories that were lost. And this isn't just fluff, right? There are economic studies from a variety of esteemed economists who have made this connection very clearly. So there's no question that it was a mistake, and it would be a mistake going forward to continue to think that we can somehow get them to change absent some kind of strong enforcement.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you.